Oofta. This is definitely one of those thanks be to God gospel readings. Although I will say, in verse 41, depart from me into eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels, is a nice change of pace from the whole weeping and gnashing of teeth line. You know, you gotta keep things fresh. But still, this is a pretty harsh story. The righteous sheep are herded to the right and onward into eternal life, and the wicked goats are herded to the left to be sent away into eternal punishment. This story is actually the inspiration for the song Sheep Go to Heaven, Goats Go to Hell by the band Cake. It's a great listen. You should check it out after the service, or, mute me and open a new tab in your browser. The other song that inevitably runs through my head whenever I read this story is that camp song that goes, I just want to be a sheep, ba, 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 ba. And speaking of camp, anyone who has spent any time up at Luther Glen and seen their goats, maybe even held a newborn baby goat in their arms, should take great exception to this story. Do they sometimes headbutt people and climb places they aren't supposed to? Sure. And yes, maybe their propensity to eat everything in sight is a little annoying, but certainly that doesn't justify being sent away into eternal punishment. I saw a picture online of a goat, and the caption read, "Naughty goats must wear the fanoodle of shame." And over each of the goat's horns had been placed a small foot-long section of a pool noodle. I feel like that's a more worthy punishment for goatly antics. And while I am getting things off my chest, can I just say that as a proud left-handed individual, I am tired of the left-hand side being the shame zone. Amen. It just isn't fair. All right, now that we've gotten all of that hard-hitting commentary out of the way, let's spend some time unpacking this story. Today is Christ the King Sunday, and at first glance, this seems like a rather odd story to have on such a day. I mean, what do you usually think of when you think of a king or a queen, a monarch or a ruler? Do images from The Crown or Game of Thrones come to mind? Pictures of someone dressed in elegant and expensive clothing, sitting on a throne, looking down over the common folk and rendering verdicts and rulings. Now, the first couple lines of today's reading really work with that imagery. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him. That's exactly what I envision when I think of Christ the King. But just a few verses later, Jesus throws us a curveball. Because rather than that royal figure that we are picturing, Jesus tells those who are gathered that he more rightly identifies with the least of these, to whom grace, love, and assistance was either offered or withheld. He is to be found among the poor, the hungry and the thirsty, the stranger and those in need of clothing, the sick and imprisoned. Not exactly the images that come to mind when we think of a king. Christ the King Sunday is actually one of the newer additions to the church calendar. It was instituted in 1925 by Pope Pius XI. As religious scholar Silas Henderson writes, he says that Pope Pius did this as a response to a world that had been ravaged by the First World War, that had begun to bow down before the lords of exploitative consumerism, nationalism, secularism, and new forms of injustice. Pope Pius envisioned a dominion by a king of peace, who came to reconcile all things, who came not to be served, but to serve. As Christians, we have a history of favoring the whole dominion of a king part over the coming to not to be served, but to serve part. There's a great deal of triumphant language about God and Jesus in our theology, in many New Testament passages, and especially in the hymns that we sing. The "My God is stronger, better, and can beat up your God" songs, images of Jesus enthroned on high, ruling over us all, set to music more fitting of a military victory parade. than the image of Jesus that we get in today's story. That image is more accurately portrayed by the picture on the cover of today's bulletin. It's a bronze sculpture by Canadian artist Timothy Schmalz entitled Homeless Jesus. And it depicts Jesus wrapped in a blanket, sleeping on a park bench. If you look closely, you will see the nail holes in the feet. The first time I came across this piece, it stopped me dead in my tracks. The image is powerful, haunting, and gut-wrenchingly moving. The first cast of the sculpture was made in 2013, but by 2016, there were a little over 100 different copies that were on display around the world. Some installations are permanent, while others move around. Ironically, more than once, the police have been called, by people thinking that this was a real homeless person who needed to be moved along. The artist says that he took inspiration from the gospel reading for today and wanted it to be a visual translation of this story. And people often ask, when will Jesus come back? When will the second coming happen, and what will it look like? Will it look like this grand judgment before the throne that we heard about today, where the wheat is separated from the chaff, the sheep from the goats, the saints from the sinners? Or will it look more like the rapture that is popularized by so many pop culture representations, where the righteous ascend into heaven in beams of light and the wicked are left behind to languish? When will Jesus return is the wrong question, because he is already here. He is found in the 34 million people who live below the poverty line in our nation. He is found in the marginalized and the oppressed of our society. He is found in our communities of color who bear the scars of slavery and colonization and who live under the crushing weight of systemic racism and oppression. He is found in the 2.3 million people who are incarcerated in our country. He is in the 14 million children who do not have enough to eat. Each one of them bears the image of Christ. Each one of them was made in the image of our Creator. So then the question that remains is, who are we in this story? Are we the sheep who have cared so diligently and faithfully for those who are in need? Or are we those wicked goats? My answer is that it really depends on the day. We've all been sitting at the stoplight after exiting the freeway and seeing the person standing there with cardboard sign in hand. Some days, I roll down my window and offer them a few dollars or a granola bar that I have, and others I stare dead ahead, pretending not to see them at all. I'm not proud of it, but I'd be lying if I told you anything else. There have been times when I've been walking down a city street and passed by someone sitting there in clear need of help and not given them a second look. And there have been times when I have doubled back and offered them the leftovers that I was carrying, or asked if I could buy them something at the convenience store. Now, I have many different answers ready for the days that I don't offer help. I mean, I'm only one person. I can't help everyone that I see, and who knows what they would spend that money on. Plus, there are so many programs and organizations where they could go and get help if they really wanted it. And all those statements are true, but they don't fully alleviate that nagging feeling in my gut. They don't fully absolve me of my guilt as I pass by. One of the things that I find most interesting about this whole story is that both of the groups that Jesus identifies, the sheep and the goats, are surprised by his words. The sheep are shocked and wonder when it was that they saw Jesus in all of those different predicaments and helped him. Certainly, they would have remembered helping out Jesus of all people. Equally shocked are the goats, who indignantly claim that if they had ever seen Jesus in such dire need, they surely would have helped him. Had we known that was you, Jesus, sitting by the side of the off-ramp or curled up under a blanket in that doorway, of course we would have helped you. The point of this story is to make us pause and consider just where it is that we see the face of Jesus in this world? Do we see it only in the rich trappings of power and prestige, wealth and influence befitting a king? Or do we see it in the hungry face of our neighbor? Do we see him standing in line for the food bank? Do we see him covered in a blanket sleeping on a park bench? And how do we respond? How do we act, especially when no one is watching? When we see a need in this world all the time in this congregation, through scraps and prayers, the Pajama Project, Bethlehem Serves, and so many more. When we donate our time, our resources, our labor, our skills, our passion to be of use for those who are in need. And we all have moments where we fall short, where we miss the mark, where we keep driving, or where we don't think we have time to help, or we are just so caught up in our own lives that we fail to even recognize the need that is in front of us. And the point is not to punish us for being human and stumbling. The point is to encourage us to dust ourselves off and try again, to lean into those sheepish tendencies and limit our goatly responses. Now, in addition to not being too hard on ourselves for those goatly moments, we must also be aware of becoming too proud of our acts of sheepish service. It can be very easy to fall into the trap of othering the least of these, of thinking that we are always on the side that is offering and giving the help, and never on the side of needing it. Because Jesus can also be found in the midst of doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals who are being stressed and stretched beyond belief, trying to respond to the coronavirus pandemic. Jesus is found among delivery persons, grocery store workers, gas station attendants, and all other essential service providers who put their own health and safety at risk to provide for their families and ensure that we as a society have the supplies and resources that we need to continue functioning. Jesus is found in the midst of nursing homes that are on lockdown. Jesus is the person who is isolated in his home, unable to gather with and embrace and share a meal with his family and the other communities that he loves. Jesus is a parent of school-age children, suddenly being forced to become a stay-at-home teacher in addition to working a full-time job. For truly I tell you, I worked in a hospital and you wore a mask. I delivered your Amazon packages and you thanked me with a smile. I sat in quarantine and you called me on the phone. I was stressed and overwhelmed and you offered me help and a sympathetic ear. As scary and apocalyptic and judgmental as this story sounds, I believe that its true purpose is to inspire and comfort us. It is a call to look for the face of Christ in the people around us. It is a call for us to treat the least of these as though they were Jesus himself, not for the recognition, not for the thanks, not even so that we can smugly count ourselves among the sheep at the end of days, but simply because it is the right thing to do. This story also offers us a word of comfort, a reminder that Jesus is always with us, that he is not some distant king enthroned on high, far away and remote. He is present in our midst. He is present in the midst of our suffering, in the midst of our greatest griefs and our most challenging struggles. He comes in the form of a king who associates with the least of these, a king who came not to be served, but to serve. And he calls us to do the same. Amen.